Good news, everyone! Tonight, trans wins around the world. The New York Times gets called out. A new alliance forged in the quest for freedom forms, and more. Good news starts right now. First up, Australia keeps dragging the rest of the world into the future, this time in New South Wales. Councillor Paige Johnson was just elected Newcastle's first openly transgender representative. The Labour candidate was voted into the city's second ward this past Saturday. Ms. Johnson's victory is another progressive step that continues the council's pioneering in the political field, starting with the election of Australia's first female Lord Mayor, Joy Cummings, in 1974. A longtime advocate for LGBTQIA+ rights, Ms. Johnson said while her focus was on local government, she understood what her victory meant for the local trans and gender diverse community. Quote, "Visibility matters, and I know how difficult it can be to see your future self somewhere where there isn't much representation of people like you," she explained. "But I also know being able to be yourself and live your truth every day makes a world of difference." You are preaching to the choir, ma'am. She is currently vice president of the advocacy organization Hunter Gender Alliance. The councillor has been a Newcastle Labour Party member for more than a decade as well. She boasts a background as a civil engineer, working on the Committee of Management of the Local Government Engineers Association, and is a Professionals Australia delegate to Newcastle's Trades Hall Council. She said, quote, "It is an honor to be elected to public office as a councillor in this progressive city. I'm determined to keep fighting for Newcastle to be a livable and inclusive place where everyone in our community can thrive. From helping on polling booths to sharing kind words, I've been overwhelmed by the goodwill I've received and am hugely appreciative of everyone's support. This victory is all your victory." Next, following up on the New Hampshire sports ban from a couple of weeks ago, as expected, the courts put the gavel down and banished the blatant bigotry. From out in New Jersey, a federal court has blocked the enforcement of New Hampshire's HB 1205, a law that prohibits transgender girls from participating in school sports, allowing two high school students, Parker Terrell and Iris Turmel, to continue playing sports while their case challenging the law proceeds. The ruling, issued September 10th, determined that HB 1205 discriminates against transgender students in violation of Title IX and the U.S. Constitution. In his decision, the judge stated that the law, quote, "on its face discriminates against transgender girls," adding that the stigma and humiliation imposed on transgender students by such laws are, quote, "substantial and irreparable." Parker Terrell, a sophomore, had previously been granted permission through an emergency court order to join her high school soccer team. This broader ruling extends the same rights to freshman Iris Turmel, allowing her to try out for the tennis and track teams at her new school. Terrell said, quote, "I just want to play the game I love with my friends." The families, represented by GLBTQ legal advocates and defenders, the ACLU of New Hampshire, and the law firm Goodwin, filed the lawsuit in August challenging HB 1205. The lawsuit argues that the law denies transgender students equal educational opportunities and violates their constitutional rights. This ruling follows similar decisions in other federal courts, which have also blocked bans on transgender students in school sports, finding them to be discriminatory, because they obviously are. The case, Terrell and Turmel versus Edelblut, will continue to move forward as the court's injunction remains in place. Similarly, an Arizona ban that was blocked last year in federal court has been double blocked on appeal from Jurist. The U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals last Monday affirmed a lower court's decision to allow 2 transgender girls to play sports in an all-girls team, despite Arizona legislation attempting to bar their participation. The plaintiffs, 2 transgender minors using the pseudonyms Kate and Megan Doe, challenged Arizona's Senate Bill 1165, the so-called Save Women's Sports Act, which bans transgender girls and women from taking part in women's sports and other teams that match their gender identity. The bill applies to all educational levels ranging from elementary school through university. In April 2023, Kate and Megan Doe sued the defendants, the Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction, and their respective schools, seeking injunctive relief. The complaints relied on Section 1681A of Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, which prohibits discrimination where a school receives federal financial assistance, and the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection and Rights of Citizens, where, quote, every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, period. In July of 2023, the U.S. District Court for the District of Arizona ruled that the act should not prevent the plaintiffs from playing sports, finding that there was no significant athletic advantage before puberty and in girls who received puberty blockers. Which is true, but there's more. The court also granted a preliminary injunction allowing the applicants to continue playing on their sports teams. The 3-panel judge of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals held that that court's decision was correct, and additionally, that the Save Women's Sports Act discriminates against transgender people, which violates the Equal Protection Clause. The case is still set to go to trial, but for the time being, the law cannot be enforced. In 2022, Arizona's Governor Doug Ducey signed Senate Bill 1165, which defined gender in interscholastic sports. The bill stated that female, women, or girls may not be open to students of the male sex, and that the legislature finds biological sex to be, quote, either male or female, and biological differences between males and females are determined genetically during embryonic development. Which raises some interesting questions about people like yours truly. On a related note, 86% of transgender and non-binary youth find that anti-trans bills negatively impact their mental health. The American Civil Liberties Union is currently tracking 530 anti-LGBTQ bills in 2024, 13 of which aim to ban transgender students from playing on sports teams. And this is why stories like this matter, because this bill, passed in 2022, is only now working its way through the courts and being prohibited for explicitly violating several federal laws. It's true that illegal laws can be struck down by the courts, but it takes years, and during that time, hundreds more bills like it can be proposed, many of which get passed, and then those are in force for years while they work their way through the courts. So it's important to report on cases like this that show those bills, even if enacted, will inevitably be struck down because they're illegal, so that maybe, just maybe, the people in charge in these legislatures across the United States stop trying to hurt us. Maybe, please. Maybe. Gavels aren't the only things coming down on discriminatory practices. This week, the New York Times was called out for their increasingly anti-trans positions at the National Convention for LGBT Journalists from Media Matters. The Association of LGBTQ+ Journalists National Convention this year convened an array of industry leaders to discuss the current state of the news media in one of the toughest years for the industry since the Great Recession. The topics of discussion included declining trust in the media and a subsequent question about mainstream media lending credence to right-wing detractors on transgender issues put an editor representing the New York Times on the defensive. Tracy Gilchrist, former editor-in-chief of The Advocate, said, quote, "We have the ability at The Advocate to not have to both sides certain stories, like whether or not gender-affirming care or trans women in sports are scientifically sound. And there are some mainstream outlets that try to both sides that. I would love to hear from those folks how they are combating that in their newsrooms, because that is a misinformation." New York Times assistant managing editor Sam Sifton jumped at the question, saying, quote, "As a mainstream news organization that covers those issues and many more, I don't think we're engaging in both sidesism. I think what we're doing is trying to embody an ideal of independent journalism that posits that our job, our mission in seeking the truth and helping people understand the world is going to prove to be a disappointment to those who find our article not to match their worldview, not to match what they believe." Well, he's half right. Sifton then compared the Times' coverage of gender-affirming care to its recent coverage of the war in Gaza, for which the paper has also come under fire after quantitative analysis from The Intercept found a pro-Israel bias, as well as a leaked internal memo advising against the use of the correct terms genocide, ethnic cleansing, and occupied territory. Sifton said, quote, "I've got to say it's tough for those of us at the Times because it's unsettling a little bit. It's a lonely feeling sometimes, saying that the criticism of the paper's Gaza coverage has been anti-Palestinian. Because it has. And what it requires of us to do is not both sides-ism. What it requires of us to do is to go out and gather as many points of view and as many fact points as we can, and, as we say, try to help people understand." Which is a colloquialism, it seems, for tell people what to think. In February 2023, the New York Times reprimanded its own staff and contributors after several members signed a pair of open letters expressing grievances with the paper's transgender coverage, dismissing those calls coming from inside the House as protests organized by advocacy groups. Media Matters and GLAAD found that 66% of New York Times articles about anti-trans legislation from February 15th, 2023 to February 15th, 2024 failed to quote a trans or gender nonconforming person. And 18% quoted misinformation from anti-trans activists without fact-checking or context. This year alone, the Times has quoted James Cantor, a psychologist who has reportedly worked on behalf of Project 2025 with the known hate group, the Alliance Defending Freedom, who has repeatedly compared homosexuality to pedophilia, specifically to fearmonger against gender-affirming care, which is totally unrelated, and published a 4,500-word column on the subject, addled with misinformation and dubious sources. Internal messages of dissent over the column were also deleted from the New York Times' internal communications. The New York Times continues to be skeptical of gender-affirming care despite the overwhelming support from, quote, every major medical institution and leading World Health Authority. And of course, while the opinions of individual reporters remains relatively unimportant, their ability to shape public opinion as the stakes continue to escalate as we approach hearings in the Supreme Court concerning Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care and the implications it will have nationwide for all trans people and many other people, makes this discourse critically important. So having one major leading news source, the New York Times, peddling openly misinformation is absolutely unforgivable. And the fact that they were censured by their fellow journalists at a journalism conference is very good news. Speaking of New York and peddlers of misinformation, folks here in my home state are getting riled up over a ballot proposal that would enshrine reproductive rights and non-discrimination protections into the state constitution. What's not to love? From WGRZ. Some Western New York high school athletes are worried about how policy changes may affect the way their sports are played, whether or not to allow trans women and trans men to compete in high school sports. Others say there is nothing to worry about. Proposition 1, a New York ballot initiative also known as the New York Equal Rights Amendment, is a proposition that would harden abortion rights in the state constitution and also give more protections against discrimination against women and LGBTQ+ people, among others. But some are fear-mongering that it would pave the way for trans athletes in women's sports, failing to make any coherent argument over why that should be a problem. Local high school athletes argue that trans athletes, specifically trans girls and women, have an unfair competitive advantage in sports, despite the fact that that has been a claim discredited at the international level by studies commissioned by the International Olympic Committee directly and published this year. People are still spreading that known falsehood, and also that it is necessary to protect children from making life-saving decisions because they may later regret it, because there's no trans people who regret not being able to transition. That doesn't happen. That's not a thing that happens. Never mind. Never mind. Pay no attention to us. It's okay. Tiffany Ellis, a former athlete, said, quote, "Treating everybody with the same rules and being fair are two different things." Ronald Piaseczny, president of Niagara Pride and supporter of Proposition 1, said, quote, "It's trying to take laws that we already have and not grant any more new protections, but simply codify those protections that we already have in other laws into the Constitution." The proposal asks voters whether they support or oppose adding language to the Constitution that people cannot be denied their civil rights based on their, quote, "race, color, ethnicity, national origin, age, disability, creed, religion, or sex. Sex including sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, as well as pregnancy status, pregnancy outcomes, reproductive health care, and autonomy." A yes vote puts these simple, basic human right protections against discrimination into the New York State Constitution. A no vote leaves these protections out. As you can no doubt imagine, there's a surprising volume of static about this fairly simple and straightforward amendment, with lots of the Red Hat Brigade Russian agents saying that it will do one outrageous thing or another. So here it is, in its entirety, what is being proposed. It adds the words underlined, such as ethnicity, national origin, age, disability, or sex, which it does include sexual orientation and gender identity. It includes pregnancy. It includes reproductive health care. And it goes on to say nothing in this section shall invalidate or prevent the adoption of any law, regulation, program, or practice that is designed to prevent or dismantle discrimination on the basis of a characteristic listed in this section. Nor shall any characteristic listed in this section be interpreted to interfere with, limit, or deny the civil rights of any person based upon any other characteristic identified in this section. In common parlance, it is a little bit verbose, but as Ronald said, it's taking protections that already exist in law and putting them properly into the state constitution where, frankly, it's a bit embarrassing that they aren't already there. And now our top story. New York isn't the only place where groups have found common cause in defending liberty from right-wing reactionaries. The inaugural Gender Liberation March took place in Washington, D.C. this weekend, and it turns out that pretty much all women, nearly all LGBT people, and nearly all Black and Indigenous people of color all have a keen interest in protecting the legal concept of bodily autonomy. Who would have guessed? From 19th News, under pride flags, Black Lives Matter flags, and Palestinian flags, thousands of LGBTQ+ people and their loved ones danced and chanted through the inaugural Gender Liberation March in Washington, D.C. on Saturday to send one unified message: that fights for reproductive rights and trans rights are inextricably linked. Raquel Wills, a transgender writer and activist who co-organized the march, said, quote, "The overarching goal here is to make these connections, to get folks to start understanding that all of our rights are on the chopping block." She wants to remind Democrats that abortion is also a trans issue. Protesters marched in defiance of state legislation restricting their access to gender-affirming care, of the Supreme Court decision that overturned the constitutional right to an abortion, and of the extreme anti-LGBTQ+ agenda detailed in Project 2025. They traveled to Washington on buses from Atlanta, from Baltimore, from New York City, from Chattanooga, from Durham. The protesters wanted to show the powers that be that their power is limited and that trans joy and queer joy do not need permission to exist. On the streets surrounding the U.S. Capitol, thousands of protesters, outnumbering the rallies of a failed former U.S. president, echoed chants led by Queen Jean, activist and founder of Black Trans Liberation. "We are America, too." Leslie Jennifer Porter and Francis George took a bus from New York City that was sponsored by the event organizers. They both listened as high-profile activists and celebrities shared their experiences about trying to access abortions, reproductive health care, and gender-affirming care. They both marched through Washington to protest the political forces seeking to ban such care, and they each brought their own signs with their own message. George, who is 25, came to Washington to convey her opposition to the anti-trans legislation that has flooded state houses in recent years. On a colorful sign, she has drawn bills banning gender-affirming care for minors, and Florida's Don't Say Gay bill burning in a fire speckled with gold glitter. She said, quote, "I'm feeling like my voice has a strong power. There's more power together. Our voices sound louder instead of being drowned out by the people with the money and the megaphones." Porter's sign, which she had worked on with friends, carried a simple message of love adorned with a few hearts, reading, "I love trans folks. They are lovely." Which is true. Based. Porter, 37, carried that sign past dozens of bicycle police guarding the grounds to the Capitol as she and other protesters marched to the Supreme Court and back to Columbus Circle. There were few counter-protesters along the march's route. As they reached the Supreme Court, 5 men stood and watched across the street, holding an Appeal to Heaven banner symbolic of the far-right and Christian nationalist movement, wore MAGA apparel, and held an anti-abortion sign. Just making sure they cover all their bases because, despite the amount of money in politics, the amount of news outlets owned by these powers that be, the actual number of people on the ground are infinitesimal in comparison. And we see it at London Pride when there were over 10,000 marchers and 19 TERFs. Or at any Pride event we saw this year where there were hundreds or thousands of celebrants depending on the size of the community the Pride event took place in. And there were 3 or 4 people shouting about going to hell and yada yada. Here we have a few thousand protesters in the nation's capital and 5 bigots showed up. So they had to represent all the different bigotries at once, because when you're that understaffed, you have to multitask. Those in the Gender Liberation March didn't bother to engage with the counter-protesters because possibly they didn't notice them or chose to ignore them. Like Porter, they carried their own declarations of love, a glittery sign reading, "Gender is splendor," a father's sign that read, "Walking for my son Nate, he is the best," and another that read, "A world without trans people has never existed." For the march organizers, threading resistance with joy and love was crucial, because to them, that joy is the antidote to the policies harming us. That's why a professional DJ was ready to hype up the crowd for a Vogue-filled dance party outside Heritage Foundation headquarters. The Conservative Foundation is, of course, the origin of Project 2025, a policy blueprint for a second Trump administration that would dramatically roll back all human rights in the United States, but especially LGBTQ+ rights. Especially women's rights, and especially minority rights. Eliel Cruz, a veteran activist and march co-organizer, said, quote, "Some of the parents were crying, describing the scene as protesters reached the Heritage Foundation building, and some started dancing." Quote, "When you're in states where you have to fight non-stop against these attacks, and maybe even flee, you just never get a chance for joy." One of the families on Cruz's mind is 17-year-old Daniel Trujillo and his parents from Tucson, Arizona. For years, Daniel and his mom have driven back and forth to the state's capital to testify against anti-LGBTQ+ bills and to speak out against efforts to ban the gender-affirming care that Daniel relies on. On Saturday, Lizette Trujillo wasn't just at the Gender Liberation March to support her transgender son. She was there as someone who chose to have an abortion at 22 and who suffered a miscarriage at 40. At Columbus Circle, with the Capitol building in the distance behind her, Trujillo said that when she saw everyone dance outside of the Heritage Foundation, she felt herself start to sob. Quote, "The last 6 years have been exhausting. We've been targeted by Breitbart, doxxed, spent many nights worried about Daniel's safety, but all this worry has only fueled our advocacy." Another parent of a transgender child, Stephen Chakumba, took the stage in Washington by reading the names of young trans people who were killed or had died by the age of 25. The list was long and included instances of lethal or near-lethal violence perpetrated on trans youth by other children. He said, quote, "This hateful rhetoric is seeping into the psyches of children, turning them into weapons. It's not just a war on trans people. It's a war on all people. Children are being groomed by a society that teaches them to fear difference. Hate is a learned behavior." Multiple speakers at the Gender Liberation March urged for action and warned against apathy in the face of rising violence against trans people. Activist Aaron Lang said on Saturday outside the Supreme Court, quote, "Some of us won't make it to the land we are trying to create, but the babies are watching us. We don't have the luxury of treating very real threats like a difference of opinion. They really want us dead. They want us gone today. So please, to the people with resources and power, quit acting like you can't do anything." Cruz said that advocates had seen a glaring lack of inclusion of trans issues in campaign conversations leading up to and including the presidential election. She said, quote, "Mobilizations like these are definitely meant to push and remind and urge our elected officials that we're making these connections and we are paying attention, and we need them to as well." Organizers scheduled the march before President Joe Biden gave up his bid for a second term in the White House and endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris to be the Democratic nominee. At the time, Democrats were predicting that former President Donald Trump could win the election and implement Project 2025 along with other extremist anti-LGBTQ+ policies. Since Harris has become the Democratic nominee, the tenor of the election has shifted, but Cruz and others say LGBTQ+ Americans face an existential crisis no matter who takes the White House next year. Organizers want Democratic leaders to speak explicitly against the vitriol targeting trans kids as well as adults. Activist Willis said, quote, "It's clear that speaking directly about the attacks, particularly on trans, on non-binary folks, feels like a liability to a lot of our Democratic leaders. There's really nothing but insinuation around being your full self in this country and having the freedom of that, but really little to no direct nods to the attacks on actual trans people are happening across the country." Advocates have fumed about the lack of meaningful engagement on LGBTQ+ issues from the media. At the September 10th debate between Harris and Trump, moderators didn't ask any questions about any GSM community issues. Sarah Kate Ellis, president of GLAAD, the nation's largest LGBT media advocacy group, said, quote, "The debate included only one mention of LGBTQ+ Americans, a smear against transgender people, that went unchallenged. Campaign reporters and debate moderators are urged to ask questions that reveal a candidate's records, views, and plans for LGBTQ Americans, so that our community is included as we are in everyday life, not simply as political talking points." GSM people and their allies increasingly represent one of the most powerful, if not forgotten, voting blocs in the nation. Advocates argue that LGBT people make up 8% of the population across all minority groups, according to census data. 2 years ago, the Human Rights Campaign, a national LGBTQ rights organization, published a report which found that queer voters would likely make up a fifth of the electorate by 2040. Even in 2024, our influence is expected to be considerable. GLAAD reported in February that 94% of LGBTQ+ people surveyed said they were likely to vote in this year's presidential election. And GSM voters aren't the only ones voting on GSM issues, advocates point out. HRC has increasingly identified equality voters, or people who are not GSM, but vote with equality in mind. Allies, you might say. The organizations reported that 75 million Americans are motivated to vote on LGBTQ+ rights. A few steps from a large-scale replica of the Liberty Bell that marks the center of Columbus Circle, actor Elliot Page and Stonewall veteran Miss Major Griffin Gracie took the stage at the march. The Trans Latina Coalition, the Black LGBTQIA+ Migrant Project, and We Testify, an organization that shares personal stories about abortion access, brought other speakers as well. Willis said, quote, "Everyone's bodily autonomy and self-determination is under attack. While this movement centers trans and non-binary people, women of all experiences, and those who may need abortion access or IVF access at some point in their lives, we're fighting for everyone's right to make decisions about their own bodies." The Gender Liberation Movement, the volunteer-run group that organized this march, intends to come back to Washington when the Supreme Court begins arguments for LW versus Skermeti, the case that will determine whether gender-affirming care bans for transgender youth are unconstitutional. Those arguments are expected to take place in December. When Willis took the stage on Saturday, she had a message for everyone to take home with them. Quote, I want every generation to come to know that no matter how you live, how you love, what you look like, how you work, how you twerk, how you twirl, no matter what your dreams or fears or desires are, we do bear fruit. If you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe. Support our work by becoming a patron at patreon.com/thetranspositions and reap heaps of benefits. Our meme of the week was posted by yours truly. And if you want to enjoy the gender-flavored jelly of your choice, join us on Discord. Also, if you have good news concerning trans people you'd like to see reported on, you can tell us about that in the Discord as well. For the Transpositions, I've been Ember Belrad.